You had some topics for this evening. Do we want to dive into that?
We can. Well, I'm gonna sneeze, I think. Bright light, no.
We know what the intro to this episode is going to be.
Hey listeners, welcome back to the Bit of a Tangent podcast, where we bring you mind-bending ideas from science, philosophy, AI, medicine, and whatever else we're thinking about at the time. I'm Jared, a medical student with a special interest in machine learning, and as always, I'll be joined by the great and powerful Gianluca. He's not just a data scientist, he's a great friend, a well of good ideas, and of even better conversations. This week, we're talking about genetic algorithms, the basics of how they work, and what they could be used for, before diving into a discussion about exercise physiology, how to get the most out of a workout, and why more really is less. Links, articles, and everything else we mentioned in the episode can be found in the show notes, so please go check those out. And as always, we do appreciate your feedback, so write to us at podtangent@gmail.com or get in touch on Twitter at podtangent, and just let us know what you think. And so, without further ado, here's the episode of Bit of a Tangent. How's your week been, sir?
Yeah, it's been full. It's been work and then working on my research as well. So I actually just decided to stop fiddling with technicalities of things and just throw a whole lot of compute at the problem and see if that got me closer to the direction I'm working with the research. So I just signed up for Amazon Web Services and just bought a whole bunch of ridiculous instances that I ran for a few hours each. So that was interesting. It's also really cool, learning experience, figuring out how Amazon sort of structures all their services and how you can sort of save a bit on some things and then spend your money on the things that are really important to the kind of computation you're doing.
All right.
So I learned a bit there, threw some money at the situation. It's helped me reach more definitive conclusions. They're just not the conclusions I was hoping for. But you can't fake truth or reality, and I think that's the whole point of scientific research. So it wouldn't be very useful if I came up with the wrong conclusion that just made me sound like I'd done something more clever than I had. But obviously there's the inbuilt there's the internal human desire to just get the thing done and have it be a success and get the paper written up as quickly as possible. And so I think, part of being an ethical and intellectually honest scientist would include constantly checking yourself for those biases.
I think it's probably appropriate just to get you to outline what your research is. Otherwise it sounds like we're leaving half the story out.
That is very true. So without going into too much detail, unless we decide to, the gist of it is that there is a drug called warfarin that is used as a blood thinner, and this is useful because blood clots are a problem in a lot of people, especially the elderly, and some have very 10% of people over the age of 80 are taking warfarin. So a large percentage of people. And the problem with warfarin is that although it's incredibly effective at thinning the blood, it is very sensitive dosage-wise. You have to get the dose just right. If you thin the blood too much, then the person will just have severe hemorrhaging.
You create rat poison.
It initially was a rat poison before it was tested on humans, which is just phenomenal. I discovered this when researching to do a presentation on on the research findings. I was getting some background, and it was a rat poison, and then someone was like, "Hey, what if we gave this to humans in lower dosages?" So you don't want to over thin the blood, because then you hemorrhage and die, and if you don't want to under thin it, because then the original blood clotting is still an issue. So you need to get that right. But the other problem is that it is incredibly specific to individuals based on genetics and diet and body size and age and various things. And so coming up with a way to determine what dose to give a human that you're trying to get into a stable therapeutic range of blood clottiness, we'll go with, is a challenge. And so there's always a quest to improve the model. So there's a publicly available data set, which for machine learning standards is puny. It's about 6,000 subjects, and there's missing data everywhere. So a lot of the work is just finding clever ways to impute information that's missing. So there's interesting stuff you can do with missing genetic information, where you can infer what the information would have been, like the consensus would have been for a specific gene, based on the SNPs that were logged, and other factors about like racial background and things like that. So you can actually, normally you would have to drop it down to like 2,000 of the 5,000 data points. But if you do some of these fancy imputation techniques, you can keep it at like 5,000, which is really useful.
Is it, I mean, this maybe is going to bring us into too deep a technical level, but is there some sort of further augmentation there where you like randomize over the plausible set of different ways that you could infer the genome to be there, and then like get some sort of average look? Or, I mean, that might be too much detail to talk about.
There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do it. The thing that's unique about this case, in terms of the imputation at least, is that there's pretty good clinically guided ways to impute it. So you don't just do it like you would with statistical methods, or you can do that for some of the things, but you can. So like a good example is if you're trying to impute some continuous variable. A decent way to do it would be to just take the mean of the other variables in the data set, right?
All right.
So if you've got a whole bunch of humans and you want to figure out the missing height, you could just take the mean height of the others. You're right, which seems reasonable. It's better than putting in 0, because very few people are 0 centimeters high, but most people are reasonably close to the mean, so you won't be off by all that much. But a better way to do it is if you have their weight information and maybe some other indicators, and you can get a much better sense of how tall someone is if you also know how much they weigh, right? So you can almost use like logistic regression to predict the missing values, and then when you've got the missing values in the complete data set, which is like the majority of the work of the project, then you get onto the really interesting part, which is now trying to actually use various statistical and eventually machine learning techniques to predict the dose that you should give a patient given what you know about them. And so that was the project. And the part that's really interesting that may be worth investigating for publication is using what's called genetic programming. It's also sometimes known as evolutionary algorithms. And it's a sort of way of replicating how nature naturally evolves individuals that are better fit to their environment, and using that to optimize some kind of computation, or some kind of algorithm, or in this case, some kind of predictive model. So instead of me sitting away trying every possibility or getting smarter and figuring out the best way to do it just from pure first principles, I instead just simulated a process of evolution whereby the most accurate models survived and mixed their predictive abilities with other accurate models and produced a new generation and so on. And this is the part that requires all the compute that I purchased. So yeah, there's a few layers to it.
There's several, deep, you might say. Or maybe you could just talk about the adjacent areas of relevance for this.
So I think, because the background of applying it to warfarin was, interesting in terms of the data sets that were available and how it was organized for my project. But in terms of the evolutionary algorithms, which I think is the really fascinating part of this, those have seen applications in a wide number of fields. Everything from I've seen something where they were applied to evolving improved designs for wind turbines to generate electricity in wind farms. So instead of just going with the standard sort of human symmetrical, they all look exactly the same. It's three reasonably thin blades, and they're just really long, and they have a certain curve and a certain like leaf shape almost to them. But this algorithm evolved things that looked really weird and unnatural and made no sense at all, but were marginally more efficient than most designs that humans produce, at least in simulation. I don't think they ever got built. So that was like one that I've seen that I thought was really cool. But there have been a few other applications in all sorts of things, from like astronomy to aspects of mathematics that I have just no grasp on, and in various other domains that relate back to more natural or real world data. So yeah, there's a handful of really cool studies that look into that. And what I really like about it, a nice way to sort of talk about it in the context of the terminology that a mathematician or a computer scientist would use, is an evolutionary algorithm is sort of a in-between point between a random walk and an exhaustive search.
So you're going to have to explain both those terms, I think. So
I'm definitely going to do that. So a random walk would be to just try stuff and see what works, right? So you got a whole bunch of switches in front of you. You don't know what any of them do. So you just start hitting them randomly in random combinations, just like a kid playing around with something. And you just see what happens, and you observe the results, and you start to sort of get an idea for what's going on. That's what a random walk is. It's just you pick at random, you change things, and you observe the results. And you would hope that you eventually stumble upon something useful. And this is, generally speaking, a bad approach. But there are cases where you can't just go and figure things out the hard way. And so a random walk is a decent strategy. So like a sort of related example for this would be what's known as like a Monte Carlo simulation, named after the gambling capital of the world, right? And so the concept of this is it's like the roulette wheel. It's just you're using random chance as part of simulations. So these are very popular with like financial models, because the underlying sort of variables are so complex that trying to model them explicitly would be computationally infeasible. But if you can just fiddle with things almost at random, it gives you a decent sense of how much fluctuation you might see and how things might go. So that's a random walk. Then an exhaustive search is a bit simpler. That's just trying every possible combination, right? So if you were trying to crack a combination lock, which probably should be called a permutation lock, you just start at 0, 0, 0, 0, and then you go to 0, 0, 0, 1 and 0, 0, 0, 2, and all the way up until 9, 9, 9, 9, and hopefully somewhere along the line it unlocks. As anyone who's stayed over a long weekend in a boarding school with friends who have combination locks on their lockers would know, it's a slow and soul-crushing process trying to break someone's combination lock just to leave a funny note or something in their locker. But yeah, that would be an exhaustive search, and that guarantees you will find the answer eventually, but that eventually might be, beyond the heat death of the universe. So what's nice about evolutionary algorithms or genetic programming is you're using this concept of natural selection, which is individuals getting improving over time in terms of their fitness for their environment, or how good they are at surviving in their niche. And you take that from the biological world and you sort of apply it inside a computational model. So what that would mean is you have a whole bunch of algorithms that are represented by like essentially a sequence of switches, so like a string of binary information, and then you flip a whole bunch of the switches at random, which is where the random element comes into play, and then you test them and see which one's better, and then those ones survive to the next generation. But then the interesting part is how you blend them together. So you kind of let them sexually reproduce.
Yeah, I mean, so are there like obvious analogs to chromosomes
It's
well preserved structures?
Yeah, the metaphor is really good. So some of the most popular methods are exactly like you mentioned, how chromosomes sort of cross over. So when it comes to human reproduction, all the chromosomes will line up, and you have what's called crossing over, where you'll have all the father's chromosomes on the left and the mother's chromosomes on the right, and they'll sort of pair up, and then bits of each one will switch between the two, so that you get some random shuffling on the chromosome. And this is very effective because it prevents you from having like devastating diseases that just wipe out your whole population if you didn't have crossing over. And it also gives the opportunity for new, never before seen combinations that may be very advantageous. So what you do is you literally take the two like sets of switches, or you can imagine them as two strings of binary characters, and you just cross them over. And the amount of crossing over can be determined by like a parameter that you set. So if you set that high, it'll happen a lot and you'll get a lot of variation, or you can set it very low and it will be much slower. Then you also get like random mutations, where you literally just will randomly flip a bit every now and then in those bit strings. And so that you can also control with the mutation rate. So the analog to natural evolution is usually very, very strong. And that's why it's really cool. It's because you can go, okay, cool, I have some understanding of how natural evolution works. Instead of me, doing really complicated statistical techniques to try and optimize my models, I'm just going to use my intuitions about natural evolution and apply them to producing better models. So if you have some good intuitions about how population size or mutation rate or selective pressures might influence the fitness of a population, you can use that and apply it to training better models.
So what I've spent a lot of time thinking about in the past week is sort of relationships and attraction and honesty, and how this relates to being able to communicate, right? And there's sort of two aspects that you need to communicate here. There is communicating intention and desire for someone, and then there's being able to communicate who you are, right? Your identity, your values, your boundaries and barriers, and what's important to you. And so those have been of particular interest for me in the past sort of week, which makes it sound terribly short term. I should probably be more concerned by that sentence.
Yeah, so I mean, the second point that you touched on was sort of having a coherence between your identity or internal values and your actions, right? So you want the way you feel and think and view the world to be evident in your behavior, right? Because that signals to people around you what your intentions are and what your values are, right? Because there's nothing weirder than when you've known someone for ages, like outside of romantic relationships, let's say, just like the person you've been friends with for ages, and then you find out that they have some deeply held value or belief that you totally would never have predicted, right? And it's just not modeled in at least the actions that you see of that person, right? So maybe it is expressed sometimes, but you've just never seen it, right? So a useful thing, I mean, if you look at when you make small talk with a person, right? And this is relevant to all sorts of relationships, from literally everything from, networking in a sort of career environment all the way through to meeting new people with potential romantic intentions, right? So you make small talk, you start off with really safe topics generally, unless you're going for sort of alternative strategies. But for the most part, you start with really safe topics. So like the current situation that you find yourself in, the weather, you would start with something quite safe. And then what you do is you sort of slowly start to like nudge things in the direction of topics that interest you or might be more controversial, and you see how the other person responds, and then you direct things away from unsafe territory and into territories of common interest and common agreement, right? And so it's like you can sometimes find someone who you meet for the first time, and very quickly you feel like you have a whole lot in common, and you can speak for a whole evening, And then you may not see them for a while, and you find out later on that they have this whole other life that doesn't match you or your interests or your beliefs or anything whatsoever, right? It's just that you both steered the conversation very naturally and very well into all these places where you do have overlap, right? Because people don't like to disagree, and I think it's part of our evolutionary and our ancestral background that social cohesion and social security, in the true sense, is so important to us and to our survival, right? So you don't want to upset people, right? So it's the last thing that we want to do, and we're hardwired to find similarity and common ground. So if you look at that, what we're doing the whole time is we're sort of signaling what our beliefs and our intentions are.
All right. It's a very Robin Hanson view about signaling, and maybe that would come
exactly, right? So you very much want to signal coherently. So you don't want to, be out there talking about how you, believe that
Earth is flat.
Yeah, Santa is putting chemicals in the water that are turning the frogs into little elves or something, right?
Subtle riff.
So, keeping up with the Joneses, of course. But you also don't want to be like offending the person, right? So like launching straight in at a, maybe like a family get together where there's some cousins who you barely know or something like that, launching straight into controversial topics, things like atheism, although that's much less controversial nowadays. But yeah, things like that, or politics, or anything that's kind of classically divisive would not be a good strategy. So when you signaling, you want to, at the same time, for your own benefit, be signaling truthfully, because you want to filter out people and conversations and interactions that don't hold as much value to you.
Yes.
Right? But at the same time, you also don't want to just be like an asshole and have everyone hate you, right? If you happen to be the one person in the world that has a particular kind of belief, which I think is difficult, and you open with that line every time, you're not going to be very popular. It's a very interesting game to play. And then on top of that, you have all these other layers that we add to make it more difficult, right? Now you add non-verbal signaling. And this can be more powerful than the verbal signaling. You add appearance, and then you add a whole bunch of like mind-altering substances onto this as well. Like you've got, at the very minimum, a lot of times alcohol or glucose,
sugar,
right,
brain.
exactly, right. Like how often have you been to an event where you're meeting people for the first time and there was neither sugar nor alcohol?
Yeah, no, it's pretty invasive.
Presumably, if there's any catering, there'll be something. It's a challenge, right? Because you want to find common ground and you want to connect with people in a meaningful way, but it must be authentic, right? You shouldn't have to fake beliefs to connect with a person, right? So that requires a very mature way of interacting from both people. And it's difficult because not everyone's going to come at you with that in return, right? It's a very difficult thing, and I'm more acutely aware of it the older I get, because some of the best conversations I've had are with people I disagree with completely on so many things, but yet the both parties in the conversation understand that we're not going to agree on even most things, but that the conversation still holds benefit to both of us, and that the other person can still be a good, decent, interesting, authentic person, right? And it's almost the authenticity there is more valuable, right? Even though it's the source of your disagreement, or as in it's where the disagreement lies, the authenticity is more valuable than the agreeing, right? So someone who can authentically disagree with you and not make it a fight is a better person, or a more enjoyable person to interact with and connect with, than someone who just agrees with everything you say, but it's totally farcical.
Julia Gayliff does a great job of framing a lot of the debates she has on her own podcast, where she always says, seek to explain, not to persuade, right? And I think, as you know, that part of explaining, right, is an honest communication of your beliefs and the sort of neighboring beliefs that lead you to logically come to that final belief of disagreement. But so around that now, I guess, I don't know if it's, just me, although I doubt it, but I think there's a lot of people really struggle to communicate these things which they either deeply believe or intend, right? So the intention we can separate out for now. But really explain to someone some of the either the unintuitive or the slightly stigmatized or the just even sometimes the more complex things we believe, right? That it takes a certain energy to explain, presents a sort of difficulty and a sort of friction to being authentic in your interactions with people. So I'm almost just curious to ask what sort of heuristics you go on. So how do you deal with trying to be authentic to what you believe and what you value while satisfying the constraints of limited time or embarrassment? Or do you even, I guess, do you think that there's a class of things that you could believe and yet be embarrassed by? And how do you deal with the clash between being authentic versus wanting some sort of level of privacy, or are all your beliefs so set, or rather you're so confident that I shouldn't be embarrassed of what I believe, therefore I should be able to talk about anything I believe?
I think this is particularly challenging for people who are, quite logical or who regard themselves as rationalists, and especially ones who try to approach perfect Bayesianism, because you kind of want to believe that, truth and genuine, accurate ideas and logical sequences of inference will win out. But that, it couldn't be, I wouldn't say it couldn't be further from the truth, but that doesn't align well with how humans actually behave. Unfortunately, maybe. The jury's still on that. There may be some benefits to it, right? So what's interesting is that you can get a lot of the way, and I'm by no means an expert on any of this, but just from observations I've made and things I've read and a few experiences I've had, it seems like as long as you can form a connection with the person, everything else just about that you believe and that you will say and talk about doesn't really matter as much, right? So two things are properly relevant here. The first is the halo effect, right? Anyone who's read any pop psychology or stuff on how to influence people knows about the halo effect. It's right. If you have one property of a person, a notable one is physical attractiveness, that is remarkable or outstanding, you will then just infer that or assume that all of the other properties about them, or many other properties about them, are remarkable as well, right? So we perceive more attractive people to be more intelligent. We perceive more intelligent people to be more competent. We, that sort of thing. And so we, even though it's on unfair grounds, and the inverse of it is true as well. Someone who's very unattractive, unfortunately, is seen as less competent and intelligent and trustworthy, and it's true for multiple properties, but very much so physical ones, because a lot of the time when you're meeting someone, that's the first thing that you have to go on. So it's really unfortunate, but there's only so much you can do about physical attractiveness for now. So the way you look, A, signals a lot about you, and B, might tie into the halo effect, right? So you can control the things that you can control as much as possible. That helps, right? The more presentable you are, obviously, the more people are going to be warm to you. And this is true in other regards of the halo effect as well, in terms of being polite, the way you stand, the way you hold yourself, how punctual you are. All of these sort of things are already signaling competence in other areas, even though you haven't exhibited it, right? So those things sort of get you a foot in the door, right? And then moving into things where you connect with the person on stuff that is very human and common to all of us, gets you this physical connection. It's almost imagine it establishing a connection, a TCP connection on the internet, right? It's you do the three-way handshake and all that kind of stuff, and you're cool, all right, we've established this connection, and then whatever you sort of transmit is kind of protected, and people will give you at least some benefit of the doubt, I've found, right? So let me make this more like tangible. So if I come to you and I start like lecturing you about transhumanism and why it's the next big thing and why I want to put an electronic like chip in your baby's brain and all of these kind of things, really, you're going to be very averse to what I'm telling you. But if I come in, I'm dressed well, I'm very polite, I give you a bottle of water, we start chatting, we talk about our kids or whatever, cool, your kid, oh, you've just had a new kid, I see your kid struggles with this genetic disease, and I had a kid who was struggling with that as well, and we tried all the therapies, none of them worked, and it was heartbreaking for me as a parent, but then we tried this experimental research, and it made this great breakthrough, and it's like I have my kid back, and all of these sort of things, and like maybe you'd really benefit from trying it, like it changed our lives, maybe it can change yours too. Like, how much more open is that person going to be to those ideas of putting microchips in their babies or some other kind of like almost transhumanist topic, right? So it's like, it's the difference between when you come, throwing the Bible at someone almost, versus connecting, establishing the emotional rapport and the empathy, right? Because it's like, if you get to the stage where someone can see all of the factors that went into your experience, like it's very seldom that people would say they would make a radically different decision to you, right? It's like if someone can perfectly empathize with you, they can totally see your point of view and why you did what you did, and they can totally understand and accept that. And then I've noticed this a lot of the time. Like, there's horrible people who have bad ideas about the world, but have a charisma to them, and you almost forgive them for it. Right? It's like take the archetype of like the rock star. Like they're just like bad people, and they're a disease a lot of the time on the people around them, and they just leave mayhem and destruction in their wake. But then they pick up an instrument or they get on stage and they just like transcend their flaws, right? And that one aspect of their talent almost just excuses everything else. Right, and you almost find yourself forgiving them because the connection that you felt to that like song or to that like energy or whatever it might be was so raw that it allowed you to almost excuse everything else. So yeah, I haven't experimentally like validated any of this, but those have just been my observations. That said, a lot of it is difficult to do.
I don't know if I've mentioned to you this book that Josh and I read. About these sort of super short, intense
what's the book called?
Weight sessions that we are trying to do. It's like book is called Body by Science. I think one of the authors is John Little. Another one is Doug McGuff, I want to say. But that's probably wrong. But anyway, so they sort of present a fairly wide body of literature on just what exactly do we know about strength training. So, for example, they present some data on the fact that multiple sets has not been shown to significantly increase like muscle gain or strength gain compared to just a single set. And of course, all of this has to be caveated by like, what does that single set look like? And in the case of Body by Science, the idea is you do extremely slow reps, right? And your metric is not actually the number of reps you do, it's the time under load for that exercise. So a typical rep might look like 10 seconds up and 10 seconds down, but you never deload at any point during the set. So you never lock out, let's say, the elbow if you're doing some sort of chest press, and you never allow, on that retraction, you never allow the weight to sink back into your shoulder girdle, loaded the whole time. And the idea is you then measure the amount of time that you can keep the load on the muscle. And the big idea for why you're doing this is because you're trying to basically, I'm going to say, get access to the fastest twitch motor units, right? So, I mean, your muscle can be like typed according to the sort of number of fibers and the speed of their metabolic pathways, and also their recovery time. And just in general, everyday life, you only ever really need to use these fairly fast recovering, slow twitch fibers. But if you can tap into these, what are called the fast twitch fibers, they are much more powerful, much greater energy utilization. And the only way to do that, though, seems to be in the situation where you have, one, exhausted the capacity, so the lifting capacity of the slow twitch muscle motor unit, and also in the setting where you have like epinephrine and other sort of stress markers on board. So what like a typical workout will look like is putting like a fairly heavy weight, upwards of 80% of your 1 rep max, and then loading, and then just doing super slow reps until you get to muscle failure, which usually happens in under 3 minutes, and then moving immediately to the next exercise.
Oh, wow. Literally straight away. Not even...
Yeah, so no rest at all. And so the entire workout takes like 15 minutes.
It's actually embarrassingly short, yeah. This is what I've been doing for the last maybe year, more even. Yeah, I think it was about 6 months after I even started doing significant weight training again. I sort of just moved to that sort of protocol. Not exactly. So the differences were that my concentric and eccentric would be about 5 seconds each, and I would have like I would I suppose deload at the extremes depending on the exercise. So like if you're talking about like chest press, like I would lockouts, but I wouldn't like overextend the shoulders. And the idea behind that was just to get the best range of motion that I could, because like mobility is also something that's like quite important to me. So yeah, not quite as extreme on the sort of slowness of the reps. And right. I was deloading temporarily at the extremes, exercise dependent. But yeah, one set, roughly 80% of your 1 rep max, and go to failure every time. And it's a beautiful thing because you can after a while you learn your body well enough, and you can start to feel that point at which the muscle gives up, but then you can feel when you've got it in almost overdrive, and you're overexerting the muscle. You can start to feel it on muscles that you work regularly enough. That point where you can feel you're actually tearing the muscle now, and it's like maybe like 3 seconds that you actually have of that right at the end, and is like where all the value is, right? It's like that whole set is just to get you to the point where everything else is knackered, and your certain fibers are getting worked, and you're pushing them beyond their regular capacity, and it's damaging them. And then you go home and you eat a whole bunch of protein for like 2 days, and it repairs it, and muscle grows. And like and it's remarkably effective. I mean, some of the hardest workouts I've ever done were under 20 minutes of like walked out of gym was under 20 minutes.
Yeah.
The hardest part afterwards is sitting in the sauna for an hour, because you want all the hormonal releases that gives you post workout, right? Like sitting in a sauna for an hour after an intense workout is fucking grueling, and I don't know, my heart rate just goes through the roof.
Yeah, I enjoy it though. I think that there are probably some mood benefits and some cardiovascular benefits that make that worth it.
Yeah. I'm keen to know what your sort of structure is with the workouts, and then with the post-workout sauna as well.
So the interesting thing about the book is they kind of advocate for this once a week training routine.
Oh, so that as well.
Yeah.
Because that's the one thing I was going to ask about. Like, this method is incredibly effective, but I mean, it destroys me.
Yeah.
Right. And so that means it's hard to build the habit, especially because you then do it less frequently, and it's very uncomfortable. Right. So it's easy for you to like put it off. And yeah, like I genuinely, like the next 2 days, I'm usually rendered partially mobile, even once I, get into the swing of training.
Yeah.
So yeah. So tell me about what you do, how you get around that, and how often you actually employ it. So
their idea is exactly that, right? That because you are going to positive failure and then a little bit beyond, you're supposed to sort of push actively against the resistance once you fail to push the weight up. So, I mean, this, as you say, will just destroy you. And that is desirable in some sense. You want that deep muscle inroading, tearing, stimulate inflammatory processes, whatever. And basically what they spoke about, and they bring up a little bit of evidence, which I would call moderately convincing, that the way to then actually get the most out of this is by taking a long enough break between sessions to allow yourself to recover. And so the model they kind of promote is this balance between this catabolic state and then a nice long period of anabolic rest and build up. And they say that what most people get wrong with strength training is they think, I'm going to go to the gym Monday, then I'm going to do Wednesday, then I'm going to do a Friday, and maybe a Sunday, like rest day or whatever. I don't know. But they say that, at some point you're going to plateau, you're going to end up not being able to lift with as much intensity in each workout. And then they also sort of cite data showing that you end up with similar levels of strength and growth anyway, just by doing this one session and creating it. So like doing one truly intense session, where you are creating that deep, deep, deep level of tissue damage and stimulation of repair processes is as good or better than like 3 sort of moderate level training sessions. So obviously that means that your 20 minutes or whatever has to be really sore. I mean,
it's at 110%.
Yeah. I mean, I tried my first like real session of this on the weekend, and it's sore. I mean,
yeah, it destroys you. Every set is agony, and then the next few days are agony as well.
Yeah. And the worst part of it, right, is because you know that your goal is failure, not a certain rep count. Like once it starts hurting, it's not like you can say, well, once I've counted to 5, great, I'm done. Like you know that the only thing you can wait for is for that muscle to fail. And I don't know about you, but in my experience, the gap between pain starting and failure coming can be uncomfortably long.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is you can, I mean, I haven't like got any data on how much this changes the result, but in terms of just being able to push through, I found if you just put the weight a little higher, roughly 80% of your 1 rep max, but let's say you go to like 85. Now the amount of time that you have to like psychologically push through is lower.
Yes.
Right? And so that said, your time under load is also lower. The potential for like injury or poor technique is increased. So yeah, it's challenging. And I think it's just like building, just being mentally strong is probably the best way to get around that. But yes, I do go quite heavy on things like that. So that it's usually like 6 reps and I'm done.
Yeah, completely.
Because you just physically can't. Yeah.
An interesting thing to add there is there's a few ideas between doing these super slow reps. And one of them, though, is that by going so slowly, you are essentially, first of all, like the first few reps will be like the warm up. And you're also really mitigating the potential for injury, right? Because you're going really slowly and like you're going to get to failure, right? Which by definition means that, you can't lift this weight up anymore, right? Now, let's just assume you're using a machine here, so you're not going to drop some barbell on yourself. Let's just take that risk away. But the idea being that because you're getting to positive failure, you're only ever lifting what you can, by definition, lift. And then once you can't lift that anymore, it's not because you've added extra weight. It's because your muscles have failed. And those are 2 different failure modes. And I think that is a much less risky way to go about it.
True. Yeah, so you said you're doing it on machines, and so I'm interested to know like what specific machines you're using and what the sort of structure is, how you split it up, what exercises you're doing.
So the book recommends what they call the big 5, which is basically a pull down, a shoulder press, a chest press, a seated row, and a leg press.
So they recommend doing everything on machines.
They recommend the machines for the sort of the brevity that you can get with that, right? It's super easy. But I think there is still some desirable aspect of free weights just in terms of balance and more muscle groups. And that's something that I'll definitely, I think, get back into because I've before I started this new thing, I've typically used free weights, and that's fine. But because you want to get through this whole thing, quickly with as few snags as possible, the machines do make that quite clean and easy.
Okay.
And they do, I think, they're quite conducive to getting that really slow rep in.
Yeah. When you isolate, it's much easier to just focus on the technique in that one motion.
Yeah.
And slow it down and not lose stability.
Yeah. And I think the picture they're painting of what I think, we know of this general distinction in exercise, right? Which I think Tim Ferriss probably mentioned, at least as early as I can remember, between exercise for like function and fitness, and then exercise for fun, right? And so they paint a really optimistic picture where you're getting all your functional fitness stuff done in 12 to 20 minutes once a week, right? Which then for me, if let's just say you set aside an hour a day for exercise, paints this really great picture where, all the stuff that you like to do, whether that's walking in the sun or biking or football or whatever it is, now you can do all of that in those bare hours, whereas there's not too much to be gained from just repetitively picking up a weight and putting it down for 2 hours a day.
So do they comment on the cardiovascular aspect of things, and the sort of mobility aspect? Because you could be doing this 20 minutes extreme workout once a week, and the rest of the time you're just totally sedentary, and I feel like that wouldn't be great for you either.
Yeah. Okay, so they actually make a really interesting point on cardiovascular fitness, which I definitely want to talk about. But then, of course, I think it is always just worth bracketing this by saying that sedentary lifestyle is an independent risk factor for a bunch of diseases. So yeah, if you're planning to say then, therefore, I can only work out once a week, well, sure, it's better than nothing, but you're still, if you sit for 8 hours a day and then go and exercise for 30 minutes, that's still not a good thing. The exercise does not make up for the 8 hours.
But so sedentary less so, but more the sort of cardiovascular aspect of it.
Okay, so let's talk about their view of cardio. So they present one sort of thought experiment, which I found quite compelling, or at least interesting. Basically, it goes like this, right? They ask you to wonder, why is it that when you walk up like a few flights of stairs versus a sort of 70-year-old, right, you get up there and you're fine, and the 70-year-old typically gets up there and is out of breath, right?
Yeah.
And now, I think for the purposes of the thought experiment, I think to make it an equal comparison, we'll just say the 70-year-old is free of true heart disease, right? So we've got no obstructed valves, narrowings, that kind of thing, right? So he has an otherwise intact cardiovascular system. It's just that he's 70 years older than you, right? And so their thing then, right, is, okay, so why is this person breathless, right? I mean, they've still got lungs, they've still got a heart, and in the absence of cardiovascular disease, which itself could cause fatigue. I mean, by no means should we doubt that. But in this otherwise healthy cardiovascular system, why is it that cardiovascular fitness seems different here, right? And they're basically thinking is that if you sit down and think about it, the idea that your heart and your lungs get fitter and stronger, I guess it's true to an extent. I mean, there's you get better capillary density, and you can maybe shift your cardiovascular physiology quicker. But I mean, the heart itself probably doesn't get much stronger, right? I mean, not in the same way that a bicep or a quadricep gets stronger. They are different kinds of muscle, right? I mean, you don't actually want your heart to hypertrophy.
To swell, yeah.
Right? So what they say, though, is one effect that we do know happens in people as they age is they get muscle wasting, sarcopenia, right? From some ridiculously sad young age onwards, you lose a percentage of your muscle bulk quite predictably, right? And so what they say is this older person has obviously a lower muscle bulk, and their muscles are also weaker, right? So now, when they have to walk up their stairs, right, they have to recruit, let's just say arbitrarily 80% of all the skeletal muscles in their body, and those skeletal muscles have to be firing at 90% of their total potential to fire at.
So they're doing more work.
So it's the same amount of work, but think about then
their exertion to achieve the same amount of work is greater.
Yeah, because I mean, so you have to, let's say, just make 30% of your muscles fire, right? We're making up these numbers, and they have to fire at 10% of their max, right? So these two different cardiovascular systems, one has to provide oxygen and blood and nutrients for 30% of the body's total capacity. One has to do for 90%. And obviously one of those is a much more demanding task. And so basically their model of cardiovascular fitness puts much more weight on strengthening muscle rather than like this ill-defined notion of a stronger or better heart.
So why does resting heart rate seem to decrease as someone gets quote unquote fitter?
So that's actually a good point and probably worth thinking about more systematically. If I remember, and geez, now I have to try and remember my first year physiology. So I think from an exercise physiology point of view, you do a bunch of things as you get fitter. Like you increase the responsiveness of your tissues to like sympathetic drive. You increase, I think, capillary density. You increase your ability to both like deliver and release oxygen in the tissues.
This is where like VO2 max sort of comes into play, right? It's like the rate at which your heart can deliver oxygen to the cells in your body when they need it, right? Like there's some volume that it will max out at, and you can potentially increase that up to some limit.
Yeah, and interestingly, what you actually want is for your red blood cells to hold on to oxygen less well. So there's a chemical you can manufacture called 2,3 BPG, which if it gets stuck in the middle of your hemoglobin, it basically makes your hemoglobin much less sticky for oxygen.
Okay.
Which
makes it a better transporter.
It makes it a better releaser. So because the lungs are really oxygen rich, right?
Yeah.
Hemoglobin has no trouble picking up the full amount of oxygen. But then when it gets to the tissues, in fact, typically in like normal circumstances, 4 oxygen molecules can bind to a hemoglobin, right? And typically you'll only really release 1 or 2. And then that blood will circulate past the tissues and go back around. And that's why you can hold your breath, right? Is because blood doesn't lose all of its oxygen in the first pass, right?
I also thought that was a result of the blood doesn't get saturated with all of the oxygen in the lungs.
So that's the other thing, right? Is your lungs have a residual volume of oxygenated air, which also will reoxygenate for a period of time.
Because I mean, most of the time we're not going anywhere near a full breath either. I mean, we're taking maybe 15 or 20% breath.
Yeah, so you're usually not breathing in as deeply and fully as you can.
Because there's no need to, because the blood isn't going to be saturated with it anyway.
Yeah.
So, and immediately, right? So it's easier to breathe shallow and often than deep and infrequently, unless you're a whale.
Yeah. So I guess the other thing that happens, sorry to go all the way back here, is in these athletes, what does happen is they also become better at offloading oxygen at tissues, and that also contributes. So I think all of these things combine to mean that they can, with one heartbeat, perfuse and meet the oxygen requirements for their metabolic requirements more so than someone whose oxygen is bound more closely to hemoglobin, who's much more insensitive to sympathetic or parasympathetic activity. But yeah, I'm definitely feeling a bit cloudy there. So
that seems to make sense, right? This is all just about how efficiently you can move molecules around at the end of the day. But yeah, like if you are stronger and your muscles are more effective, you also have less work to do. Well, no, you never have less work to do, but the relative exertion is lower. And so you require less. There's less demand on your resources, because that's the thing. It's like you're still having to move the same amount of like oxygen or whatever, but it's just easier to do.
Yeah, it's so, less demand, right?
Yeah, but so I mean, there's obviously a lot of value to be had in the cardiovascular exercise, and this high intensity training with regards to strength training obviously brings up the question of like high intensity interval training.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're familiar with the 1 minute workout, which is sort of the buzz term created by the researcher who looks into high intensity intervals, and the idea of not being that you work out for physically 1 minute, but that essentially all you need to get the equivalent of the sort of 30 minutes a day of steady state cardio, but in shorter time, is 3 intervals of 20 seconds where you're going at 100% capacity, with 1 minute 30-second breaks in between and a short warm up and cool down. And so the 20 seconds cumulatively make up the 1 minute. That's the actual exertion. The rest is all just sort of coming down from that state. So what do they recommend in the book is you should do on your off days? I mean, they're not saying rest means you do no physical activity, but how extreme should you go, right? I feel like going for a light jog is much more conducive to regenerating muscle tissue than doing like a hit session of boxing or something, because you feel like you're probably doing some muscle damage there.
So they don't actually touch what you should do in your off days as much as perhaps they could.
Okay.
But I think the general picture you get is one where you're viewing the rest of your week as anabolic rest time, and then following the general guidelines of, we should be sitting less, you should be active and walking and taking the stairs, right?
Yeah.
And then I guess it's sort of like whatever that hour that you would usually use to do strength training in, it's now like use that to do something enjoyable and active.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, if you are a 5K jogger, I'm pretty sure that that's not going to be a huge problem.
Not an issue. For me, though, like time and just willpower is the thing. I mean, I really don't like doing steady state cardio.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like, it's not my thing, because I just feel like the mental game for me is just the difficult part. Like, I've just been like, I have to put up with this. Whereas, hits I can really get behind because it's there. I'm fully focused. I'm fully engaged. And like, it's the same thing as doing the everything to failure one set type strength training. And it's like, you're done in 15 to 20 minutes, right? And you are knackered. I did a hit session. I've been doing sort of boxing oriented ones lately, where I sort of just do like a sort of kickboxing style sparring with a bag, but it's like, I'm sort of just dodging and weaving and throwing the odd jab for the rest intervals, and then for the 20 seconds I'm trying to kill that bag using every tool at my disposal, be it kicks or elbow strikes or whatever. I mean, I probably look like a raving lunatic to everyone else who's doing the little jab stuff the entire time. But yeah, so I've been doing that, and like it's pretty intense. And it takes a toll on the body in terms of like the muscle, like throwing a hard punch or a kick actually recruits quite a bit of muscle, right?
Yeah.
So I've actually found like the muscle soreness was the main thing, delayed onset muscle soreness. Today I went and did a watt bike session. I think it's actually a brand, watt bike. The gist of it is like, it's like an elliptical type bicycle, but you have like arm bars as well that are connected to the same mechanism. And so you can push your arms back and forth and cycle, and it's all connected up to this big like fan essentially that creates resistance. And so the point being is you just like using all your appendages together to like produce as much energy, thus the term watt bike, as possible. And man, it's a different ball game. I did 5 intervals of those 20-second bursts with 1 minute 30 breaks in between. And I mean, by the time I got to the third one, I was already like, oh my God, what have I done? I'm going to make myself sick. By the time I was done, I mean, I had to take like a 5-minute cool down just so I didn't pass out because my blood was flowing. 15 minutes later, I had left the gym. I had walked back home and I got into the apartment and I was like, oh my God, I have to sit down. I'm like still on the edge of passing out. And it took me like another 10 minutes after that before I had like the energy and the just like composure to go and shower. I mean, it was a whole nother ball game, right? Like the hits is incredibly effective at just getting you knackered. I mean, like this is the equivalent of me doing a like 15K run, I presume, because I've never done a 15K run before. I max out at 5 and I'm just like, I'm too bored. But yeah, one of my most successful sort of medium distance for other athletes or long distance for me runs was listening to the Joe Rogan episode with Elon Musk, where he smokes the joint, the famous and highly memed one. And I was just so into the podcast, and it was a beautiful sunny day. I was out by my family place. So it was like, far away from the city. And I was just so focused on the podcast. And like next thing, my phone's like going, oh, you reached your goal of 5 kilometers. And I just had no idea I'd been running. But that's the only time running's ever been pleasant ever.
In the history of humanity. Yeah.
The rest of the history of humanity. The rest of the time, I just want to get in there and get done. Generally, it's after work as well. So like I've got like 15 minutes of willpower left, and I need to just get there and get it over with. So yeah, I'm all about the short bursts. But now I'm wondering like how best to stack the cardiovascular aspect with the strength training, and in terms of like not like overworking myself, but also getting a bit of variety in for range of motion purposes and for just not getting bored as well.
I think it's obviously going to be something where I think applying the mental model of sometimes the way to get more of what you want is to restrict yourself instead of adding in more things.
Okay.
And so, if you hit some sort of plateau, or you're finding yourself fatigued, or you're finding you're not increasing in strength or fitness, ask yourself, what could I actually cut out here? If I could only do 2 exercises a week, what would I end up doing? And you could just test that out for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and see, do your energy levels go up? It's a worthwhile experiment to run, because you might just be in that phase where you actually need more recovery time between sessions, and doing that finally gives you the sort of latency to go back to more intense training.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, the thing for me was that I just got to the point where I had refined my workout to this 20-minute destroyer of muscle. Because I was literally like reading papers, and I was just doing as much research as I could. I got very into it and the science behind it. And I had like the nutrition thing pretty figured out and the workout pretty figured out. But the problem was I would just go on like a Monday, be like, cool, I'm going to do 2 big workouts this week and maybe some jogging on the other days. And just like, I'd go on the Monday, destroy myself, be hobbling around for the rest of the week, and just eventually just couldn't keep that up because I would always be like, oh, I'm too tired today. The acrasia is much harder to fight when you don't do the thing as often and when the thing is much harder. And so I had engineered this thing that was incredibly intense.
What were the exercises you were doing out of interest?
I mean, I literally keep it as simple as possible. So it's the same sort of big 5 type setup, except it's all with compound lifts. And I don't do shoulder press because what I found is that I was developing the anterior part of the deltoid muscle because I was always doing shoulder press. And I couldn't understand why my shoulders were not growing, especially when I initially started, like everything else was. And it was because you get no activation of the lateral deltoid, which is what gives your shoulder the shape that is like aesthetically appeasing and just makes you look good in clothing and stuff. And so I was like, okay, cool, I'll just drop the press and do the lateral raises. And so I sub that in. So that's like pretty much the lightest thing. I do that to warm up. So it's just like really slow raises with barbells. Laterally, there's some really good like YouTube tutorials on how to get the optimal activation for that. So I'll usually start with that. Then I'll go over and probably do squats next. So just, really heavy squats. Then I will go do pull-ups. And I found a way of doing pull-ups. I've never managed to do more than 3. Right? I've just found the method pull-ups so on. So if you imagine just hanging from a bar, you do that, except now engage your back and your shoulders just enough so that you're not hanging. You're just like 1 step up from that. So it's like the very like first motion if you were doing a dead hang pull-up. So that's the extent that I stop at. So I start by hanging like that for a little while, like 15, 20 seconds. So I'm already testing the grip strength here. It's already like under load. Then I go and do as slow as I possibly can, up and down, highly controlled. The rest of the body is like totally motionless. There's no swinging or anything going on here. And on the way down, you stop halfway and you pause for a second and then carry on going down. Never been able to do more than 3. The other thing is that you just, on the last one, on your way down, you just make it extra long and slow because you can feel that you're done. And then when it comes to like getting yourself up from the almost dead hang again, you just can't, because that's the hardest part, right? And it's like on that third one on the way down, you're like, this is it. You can feel you can't even stop your body from just falling anymore. So that's a really good one. I actually sometimes throw in like heavily weighted lunges because that's really good at getting the hamstrings activated, I've found. Hamstrings like one thing that's like no fun for me to work in isolation. But when I do the lunges, it's nice because I get really good activation on like my glutes and my core as well, because you're having to stabilize. So I'll usually do that like in the same way you would put a bar on your back for doing a back squat. You would do that and then do lunges. I haven't seen very many other people recommend that. And I've done it with kettlebells in the past before. But yeah, so that's quite a good one. Then I'll go to like deadlift. And then as I'm sort of like, that's pretty tiring. I'll then go and do dips and low row in whatever order equipment is freed up. And I'm feeling bench press. I usually do the bench press with dumbbells actually, because I feel like it activates my chest more, whereas if I do it with the bar, it feels like my triceps burn out before my chest. But that may just be like my technique being suboptimal. I think that's everything. I may be forgetting like one or two things, and occasionally I'll just throw in something extra or leave one thing out if I've got like something that's sore or whatever. But that's just the rough template, and that kills me. Everything's to failure, everything's slow, everything's like mostly constantly under load. Yeah, so that's what I've just found is like works for me. It's pretty quick, easy to do. Yeah, and then if I have a sauna available, jumping in the sauna after that apparently is like extremely good for you. I think it's Dr. Rhonda Patrick goes into like great detail about the benefits of a sauna post-workout. And I believe it's to do with, is it heat shock protein?
Heat shock protein, yeah.
Is the protein that's activated as a result of the heat exposure, and it's apparently very useful in the hypertrophy cause, and a whole bunch of other metabolic benefits. But that part's quite grueling. And you also have to be pretty careful with the sauna thing, because you can find yourself getting like really close to fainting sometimes if you've done a heavy workout and you're in a hot sauna afterwards. So it requires a bit of monitoring.
Yeah, it definitely is worth being a bit cautious.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, speaking of which, sir, are you just about ready to wrap this up?
I think so, yeah.
All right, excellent.
Cool. It's been an interesting chat.
That was a different one, folks. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed that episode, please get in touch and share your thoughts. You can email us at podtangent@gmail.com. Connect with us on Twitter. Our handle is @podtangent. And for more information, as well as show notes for this and other episodes, our website is podtangent.com. If you like the show, the two biggest things you can do to help us out would be recommending it to a friend you think might like it, or rating and reviewing on iTunes. These both make a disproportionate impact on the course of the show, and we'd really, really appreciate it. We have both loved having these discussions, and we're looking forward to having many more. So thank you for listening. Your support and listenership are really, really appreciated. Until next time. Achoo!